My son stood in front of me, pointing at the villa I had poured my life into. His words were sharp, almost casual. "This is theirs now. You are not allowed to come." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The place where I had raised him, where his mother's voice still seemed to echo, was handed away like it was nothing. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced a smile and said nothing. When they came smiling to claim the villa, they found my surprise, one they would never forget. Now, before I share what happened next, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving it a thumbs up. The past 13 months since my wife Margaret died had been a blur of empty days and sleepless nights. Cancer had taken her slowly, painfully, leaving me adrift in a house too full of memories. Garrett and Vera had been visiting more often lately, bringing groceries, helping with bills, suggesting I needed more rest. Their concern had seemed genuine, and in my vulnerable state, I'd welcomed it. Now, standing in my living room with papers in hand, my son's expression told a different story entirely. The document Garrett pushed toward me was thick with legal language, multiple pages stapled together. Last week, he'd asked me to sign some insurance paperwork, updating beneficiaries after Margaret's death. I'd been exhausted that day, having spent the morning going through her belongings, crying over photo albums. My eyes had been too blurry with tears to read properly, my mind too clouded with memories. I'd trusted my son completely, signed where he pointed, believed him when he said it was routine. But the way he avoided my eyes now suggested it had been anything but routine. Vera moved closer, her perfume overwhelming in its sweetness, nothing like the subtle lavender Margaret had preferred. She placed her hand on Garrett's shoulder, a gesture that looked supportive, but felt controlling. Her smile never quite reached her eyes as she spoke about making changes to the house, updates that would be good for everyone. Behind her, Dolores was already examining the china cabinet, running her fingers over Margaret's collection of porcelain birds with a possessiveness that made my stomach turn. Silas had settled into my leather recliner, scrolling through his phone as if he belonged there. The conversation unfolded in fragments that didn't quite connect. Garrett mentioned concerns about my health, my ability to maintain such a large property alone. Vera talked about a family needing space, about plans for the future, her hand drifting to her stomach in what seemed like a meaningful gesture. Dolores added comments about safety, about elderly people living alone, statistics about accidents and falls. Each point seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture I was only beginning to understand. They weren't here to help. They were here to take. I asked to see the document again, the one I'd signed last week. Garrett hesitated before handing it over, and as I read more carefully this time, the blood drained from my face. This wasn't insurance paperwork. It was a deed transfer, signing over ownership of the villa to Garrett, who had apparently already transferred it to Vera's name. The notarization date was wrong, the stamp slightly smudged, details that should have been red flags if I'd been paying attention. But grief and trust had blinded me to my son's deception. "This is theirs now," Garrett finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, gesturing toward Vera's family. "You are not allowed to come." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The villa where I'd raised him, where his mother had taught him to ride a bike in the driveway, where we'd celebrated every Christmas for 25 years, was being stolen by the woman he'd married just 3 years ago. I wanted to rage, to fight, to demand explanation, but something in their coordinated presence, their prepared responses, told me this had been planned for a long time. Vera's mask slipped slightly as she explained their plans for the house. She spoke about renovations, about converting Margaret's garden into a pool area, about updating the outdated kitchen where my wife had cooked thousands of meals. Each word was a small cruelty, dismissing the life we'd built here as something obsolete, ready for disposal. She mentioned a nursing facility called Sunshine Acres, already researched, already contacted, a room already reserved. The efficiency of their planning was breathtaking in its coldness. I noticed details that hadn't registered before. Dolores had a notebook with measurements, rough sketches of room layouts. Silas had been taking photos earlier, I remembered now, documenting the house like an appraiser. There were boxes in the hallway I hadn't seen them bring in, ready to pack my belongings or perhaps to move their own things in. This wasn't a sudden decision or a desperate measure. This was a carefully orchestrated takeover that had probably been in motion since before Margaret's death. The thought of my wife made me pause. She'd been the sharp one, the one who noticed details, who sensed when something was off. In her final months, she'd mentioned concerns about Vera, observations that seemed paranoid at the time. She'd insisted on handling certain financial matters herself, making trips to the bank and lawyer despite her weakness. She'd organized documents obsessively, creating files I hadn't understood the purpose of. Now, standing in my soon-to-be former home, I wondered what she'd known, what she'd tried to protect against. Garrett couldn't maintain eye contact as he explained that I needed to pack essential items. Everything else would be handled, he said, though he didn't specify how. The family photos on the mantel, the quilts Margaret had made, the books we'd collected over decades, all of it would be sorted, donated, or disposed of according to their judgment. My life was being edited down to what could fit in a nursing home room, my history erased to make room for their future. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 o'clock, its deep bronze tone familiar and comforting, even in this moment of betrayal. That clock had belonged to my father, marking time in this house for over 30 years. It had witnessed our joys and sorrows, our celebrations and arguments, the full spectrum of a life lived together. Now, it would mark time for strangers who saw it as nothing more than an antique, valuable perhaps, but meaningless in its history. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady not from age but from shock. The room seemed to spin slightly, whether from the emotional blow or something else, I couldn't tell. I'd been feeling unwell lately. Fatigue and confusion I'd attributed to grief. Occasional nausea I'd blamed on poor eating habits since Margaret's death. Looking at Vera's satisfied expression, Dolores's impatience, Silas's casual indifference, I wondered if my symptoms had a different cause entirely. I understand, I said quietly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. There was no point in fighting here. Now, when they held all the cards, and I didn't even know what game we were playing. But understanding and accepting were different things entirely. As I moved toward the door, gathering my jacket and car keys, my mind was already working, remembering Margaret's warnings, her preparations, her insistence that I pay attention to details. Vera walked me to the door, playing the concerned daughter-in-law one last time. She mentioned that they'd found some issues with the house, structural problems that would be expensive to fix, implying I should be grateful to be free of such burdens. But there was something in her eagerness, her need to justify what they were doing, that suggested fear beneath the confidence. They were rushing, pushing me out quickly, and rushed plans often had flaws. As I reached my car, I turned back to look at the villa one more time. It stood solid and welcoming in the afternoon light. White walls gleaming, windows reflecting the sky. Through the front window, I could see them already rearranging furniture, claiming space that wasn't yet legally theirs. The deed transfer might have my signature, but something about it felt wrong, incomplete. Margaret had always said the devil was in the details, and there were details here that didn't add up. I sat in my car for a moment, key in the ignition, but not turning it, watching my son and his wife through the window. Garrett looked miserable, conflicted, like someone who'd made a deal with the devil and was only now understanding the price. Vera was animated, directing her family in their takeover, but her movements were sharp, nervous, like someone afraid of being caught. They thought they'd won, but games weren't over until all the pieces had been played. The drive to find temporary lodging gave me time to think, to process what had happened. The Paradise Inn motel was far from paradise, but it was cheap, and the desk clerk didn't ask questions when I paid cash for a week up front. As I settled into the small, musty room, I made a mental list of what I needed to do. Check the storage unit where Margaret had insisted we keep important documents. Contact the lawyer she'd been seeing. Look into the deed transfer more carefully. And most importantly, figure out what my wife had known and what she'd done to protect us. Something wasn't right here. Beyond the obvious betrayal, the speed of their actions, the prepared nature of their plan, the physical symptoms I'd been experiencing, all of it suggested something darker than simple greed. As I lay on the uncomfortable motel bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, I whispered a promise to my dead wife and to myself. They might have taken the house, but the game wasn't over. Margaret had been preparing for something in those final months, and it was time I found out what. The storage unit was across town, in an industrial area that looked abandoned even during business hours. I'd driven there early, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar motel bed, my mind racing with questions about what Margaret might have hidden. The metal door rolled up with a screech that echoed through the empty corridor, revealing towers of boxes, each labeled in my wife's neat handwriting. Most contained ordinary things like holiday decorations and old tax documents, but one unmarked box in the back corner was wrapped in plastic, protected like something precious. My phone sat silent on the dashboard as I drove back to the motel with the box. Garrett hadn't called or texted since yesterday's betrayal. 42 years of raising him, teaching him right from wrong, sacrificing so he could have opportunities we never had. And this was how it ended. Not with gratitude or even an explanation, just cold silence that said everything was already decided. The son I'd loved had chosen his wife's family over his own father, and the rejection stung worse than any physical pain. Inside the box, I found things that made my hands shake. Photos of Vera with different men, older men, all dated before she met Garrett. Printouts of emails between anonymous accounts discussing someone referred to as the Mark, and timeline references that aligned with when Garrett met Vera. Medical articles about ethylene glycol poisoning, symptoms highlighted in yellow marker. Bank statements from accounts I didn't recognize. And at the bottom, a USB drive labeled simply Insurance in Margaret's handwriting, dated 2 months before her death. The motel's ancient laptop wheezed to life when I plugged it in. $20 to rent it from the front desk, probably worth $5, but it would serve my purpose. When I inserted the USB drive, a single video file appeared. Margaret's face filled the screen, thin from cancer, but eyes sharp with purpose. She sat in our bedroom, the familiar quilt behind her, speaking directly to the camera in her teacher voice, clear and measured, every word carefully chosen. She didn't make specific accusations, but her message was clear through carefully chosen words. She spoke about property protection, about complexity in ownership documents, about the importance of looking deeper when things seemed wrong. She mentioned consulting professionals, making arrangements that would only matter if something happened after her death. She talked about patterns in behavior, about people who weren't what they seemed, about the importance of documentation. The video was only 4 minutes long, but I watched it repeatedly, searching for hidden meanings in every phrase. Among the papers, I found email printouts that chilled me. Conversations between anonymous accounts discussing timing, patience, establishing trust over 3 years. One mentioned that the mother's death will be the trigger, and another said, "Make sure the old man signs without reading." The emails were dated starting 6 months before Garrett supposedly randomly met Vera at a coffee shop. Their entire relationship had been orchestrated, planned, targeted. My son hadn't fallen in love. He'd fallen into a trap. The medical articles about poisoning made me examine my recent symptoms with new eyes. Fatigue that came in waves, confusion that seemed worse after meals, occasional nausea I'd blamed on grief. The articles described how antifreeze could be administered in small doses over time, sweet-tasting and easily hidden in food or drink. Margaret had highlighted passages about kidney damage, about how symptoms could be mistaken for natural aging or depression. Had she suspected I was being poisoned? Had she been trying to warn me? I called Marcus, a former student who'd become a property lawyer, someone I'd taught calculus to 20 years ago. He remembered me immediately, agreed to look into the deed transfer quietly. While waiting for his callback, I organized everything chronologically, building a timeline of Margaret's discoveries. She'd been investigating something for at least a year before her death, gathering evidence like a detective building a case. But why hadn't she told me directly? What had she been afraid of? Garrett finally called as evening fell, his voice strained and strange. He asked if I'd found a place to stay, if I needed anything, the questions perfunctory and hollow. In the background, I could hear Vera speaking sharply in what sounded like another language, maybe Russian or something Eastern European. When I asked Garrett if he was okay, there was a long pause before he said everything was fine. But nothing about his voice suggested fine. He sounded like someone reading from a script with a gun to his head. Marcus called back within hours with information that changed everything. The deed transfer had serious problems. The property description didn't match our villa's address exactly, off by numbers that seemed like clerical errors, but legally significant. More interesting, he'd found records showing Margaret had transferred partial ownership to a trust 2 years ago, which would complicate any property transfer. The deed I'd signed might be worthless, or at least challengeable, but there was more. The notary who'd supposedly witnessed my signature had died 3 months ago. I spent the night going through more documents, finding receipts for things I didn't remember buying. Multiple purchases of antifreeze over several months, always paid in cash, always from different stores. Security system upgrades I hadn't ordered. Legal consultations I hadn't attended. Margaret had been busy in her final year, spending money we didn't have on preparations I didn't understand. Every receipt, every document was another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to see. Sleep was impossible, so I drove past the villa at 3 a.m. The house was dark, except for a light in the basement, unusual since we rarely used that space. Shadows moved behind the small window, multiple figures doing something that required late-night privacy. I thought about Margaret down there sometimes, organizing holiday decorations or old photos. Had she been doing something else entirely? Had she been preparing for this exact situation? The next morning brought a text from Garrett that made my blood run cold. Dad, Vera found some old documents in the attic. She's asking about Mom's will. Did Mom own part of the house? They'd found something that challenged their claim, something that scared them enough to break their silence. I didn't respond immediately, letting them worry, letting fear eat at whatever conscience they might have left. Margaret had set something in motion, and they were just beginning to realize it. I returned to the storage unit, looking for more boxes, more clues. In one marked with last year's date, I found medical test results I didn't remember authorizing. Blood work showing elevated levels of ethylene glycol in my system from 6 months ago. Not lethal, but consistent with slow poisoning. There were similar tests for Garrett showing lower levels. We were both being poisoned, father and son, though at different rates. The realization that they were hurting Garrett, too, changed my anger into something colder, more focused. There was also a business card for a private investigator named Rodriguez, with a handwritten note on the back. He knows. Start recording everything. A phone number, a meeting time from 8 months ago, evidence that Margaret had sought professional help. When I called the number, it was disconnected. But an internet search revealed Rodriguez had moved to another state suddenly. His office closed. His cases transferred to other investigators. Something had scared him off, but not before he'd given Margaret whatever information she'd needed. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't ignore. Vera and her family were professionals, criminals who'd done this before. Margaret had discovered their plan and spent her dying months building some kind of defense against it. The documents she'd filed, the evidence she'd gathered, the preparations she'd made, all of it was designed to protect us even after her death. But protect us how? What exactly had she put in place? That evening, I sat in the motel room studying everything again, looking for patterns, connections, instructions. Margaret had been a chess player, always thinking several moves ahead. She wouldn't have gathered all this evidence without a plan to use it. Somewhere in these documents, these videos, these carefully preserved receipts, was her strategy for defeating the people who'd invaded our lives. I just had to be smart enough to see it, patient enough to let it unfold. The grandfather clock in the villa would be chiming midnight now, I thought, still keeping time in what used to be our home. Time was a strange thing, moving fast when you wanted it to stop, crawling when you needed it to hurry. Margaret had known her time was limited, had used every moment to prepare for this. Now it was my turn to use time wisely, to let her plan reveal itself, to trust that my brilliant wife had thought of everything. Tomorrow I would visit the villa again, pretend to retrieve some belongings, and look for whatever had Vera and her family searching the attic in panic. Tomorrow, I would dig deeper into the legal complications Marcus had discovered. Tomorrow, I would understand more of what Margaret had done. But tonight, I simply sat with her ghost, feeling her presence in every document she'd touched, every note she'd written, every piece of evidence she'd preserved. She was gone, but not powerless. Dead, but still fighting. And through her preparations, still protecting the family she'd loved. The morning brought an unexpected call from Garrett, his voice different from yesterday, more urgent and confused. He asked me to come to the villa to collect some personal items, but there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't his idea. I could hear Vera in the background, her words unclear, but her tone sharp and demanding. When I agreed to come, there was relief in his voice, but also warning. Something was happening at the house, something that had them all on edge. The drive to the villa felt like approaching a crime scene, which in a way it was. My home had been stolen, my life dismantled, my trust betrayed. But now, armed with Margaret's evidence, I saw everything differently. This wasn't just about property theft. This was about murder, attempted and possibly planned. Every interaction with Vera and her family took on new significance, every word potentially revealing their true intentions. When I arrived, the house looked different even from the outside. Boxes were stacked on the porch. Furniture visible through windows had been rearranged, and there was a van in the driveway I didn't recognize. The garden Margaret had tended so carefully showed signs of neglect already, just days after I'd left. They were destroying everything we'd built, erasing our presence with systematic efficiency. But their haste suggested fear, not confidence. Vera answered the door wearing one of Margaret's robes, the silk anniversary gift I'd saved 6 months to buy. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She smiled, all fake warmth and practiced concern, asking about my health, my accommodations, whether I needed anything. But her eyes kept darting toward the basement door, and there was tension in her shoulders that suggested barely contained panic. Something in the house was wrong, and they couldn't figure out what. Inside, the chaos was more apparent. Dolores was in the kitchen, going through drawers with frantic energy, clearly searching for something specific. Silas sat at the bottom of the basement stairs like a guard, playing with his phone but alert to any movement in that direction. The basement door, I noticed, had been recently painted, bright white that stood out against the older walls. They were hiding something down there, or trying to. Garrett appeared from upstairs looking terrible, pale and shaky like he'd been sick. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes that might have been shame or might have been a warning. He couldn't meet my gaze directly, instead focusing on points past my shoulder, his voice artificially cheerful as he talked about the renovations they were planning. But his hands shook as he gestured, and I noticed he kept touching his stomach, wincing slightly as if in pain. I asked to go to the attic to retrieve photo albums, and the request triggered an immediate reaction. Vera insisted on accompanying me, not asking but declaring it like a security escort. Dolores and Silas exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. As we climbed the stairs, I noticed Vera stayed close behind me, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixing with something else, something chemical and sharp. Had she been handling cleaning supplies, or something more sinister? The attic was in chaos, boxes torn open, contents scattered everywhere. My wife's careful organization system had been destroyed in what looked like a desperate search. Christmas decorations mixed with tax documents, photo albums scattered among old clothes. They'd been looking for something specific, something they believed was hidden up here. As I gathered a few photo albums, I noticed a folder that had fallen behind an old dresser, almost invisible. I managed to retrieve it along with the albums without Vera noticing, her attention focused on her constantly buzzing phone. Back downstairs, I observed more strange behavior. Dolores had moved from the kitchen to the living room, now searching through the bookshelves, removing books and checking behind them. Silas had abandoned his post at the basement door, but kept glancing toward it nervously. There was a smell coming from down there. Paint mixed with something else, something that made my eyes water slightly. Fresh paint couldn't completely cover whatever they were trying to hide. Vera kept touching her stomach, the gesture I'd noticed before but now saw more clearly. It was rehearsed, deliberate, the way an actor might portray pregnancy on stage. But there was something off about it, the timing wrong, the placement too varied. She wore loose clothing that could hide or suggest, depending on the angle. Was she pretending to be pregnant? If so, why? What could that possibly gain her in this situation? The conversation turned strange when Dolores suddenly spoke to Vera in rapid Russian, forgetting or not caring that I was there. Vera responded sharply in the same language, and an argument erupted between them. Silas joined in, his voice lower but insistent. They seemed to be discussing timing, urgency, someone coming or something happening soon. When they remembered my presence, they switched back to English, Vera laughing artificially and claiming they were discussing recipes. Garrett excused himself to take a phone call in the backyard, and through the window, I watched him pace, gesturing frantically. When he returned, he looked even worse, sweat on his forehead despite the cool day. He mumbled something about work stress, but Vera's sharp look suggested she knew exactly what the call had been about. The dynamic between them was fascinating and disturbing, both seeming to hold secrets from each other while maintaining a facade of marriage. I made an excuse to use the bathroom and instead slipped into Margaret's old craft room. Everything had been searched here too, but less violently, as if they'd been looking for something specific, rather than just ransacking. In a drawer they'd missed, I found another USB drive, unlabeled but hidden in a way Margaret knew I'd recognize. She'd always hidden important things in plain sight, in places that looked ordinary but held significance only to us. When I emerged, Vera was waiting in the hallway, having noticed my detour. She smiled, But there was ice in her eyes as she suggested I should leave soon, that they had appointments to prepare for. The dismissal was clear, but so was the fear beneath it. They wanted me gone, needed me gone, but not just from the house. The poisoning evidence Margaret had collected suggested they wanted me gone permanently, and my continued existence was complicating their plans. As I prepared to leave, I noticed more details that didn't fit. Mail addressed to names I didn't recognize. Luggage in the hallway that looked ready for travel. Documents burning in the fireplace despite the warm day. They were preparing to run, but something was keeping them here. Something in this house they needed to find or destroy before they could safely disappear. Margaret had trapped them somehow, even in death. At the door, Vera grabbed my arm, her nails digging in slightly. "If you remember anything about Mom's papers, anything she might have hidden, you'll tell us, won't you?" The desperation in her voice was barely concealed. I smiled, the same non-committal smile I'd used with difficult students for decades, and promised nothing. Let them wonder what I knew, what I'd found, what Margaret had told me. Uncertainty was a weapon too. Driving away, I noticed a car following me at a distance, trying to be discreet but failing. They were watching me now, worried about what I might do or discover. Good. Let them waste resources on surveillance while I pieced together Margaret's plan. The folder from the attic contained bank statements from an account I'd never seen, regular deposits and withdrawals that suggested Margaret had been funding something substantial. The dates aligned with her meetings with lawyers and investigators. That evening, I plugged in the USB drive from the craft room. It contained surveillance footage from cameras I didn't know we had. Videos of Vera adding something to my coffee. Dolores grinding pills into food. Silas removing items from the house when he thought no one was watching. The evidence was damning, undeniable, and date-stamped. Margaret had been building a case for months, documenting crimes as they happened. But why hadn't she acted on it while alive? The answer came in a document titled Instructions, dated a week before her death. She'd known she was running out of time, knew she couldn't fight them directly while weakened by cancer, so she'd built what she called a delayed justice system, evidence and legal mechanisms that would activate after her death. She'd anticipated that they would make their move once she was gone, and she'd prepared accordingly. The house itself had become a trap, and they'd walked right into it. I spent the night reviewing everything, understanding finally the full scope of Margaret's plan. She'd hidden evidence throughout the house, in places they'd never think to look. She'd set up legal protections that would trigger under specific conditions. She'd even arranged for certain information to be automatically released if something happened to me. The woman I'd loved for 43 years had become a strategic genius in her final months, using her death as a weapon against those who would harm her family. The motel room felt less like a prison now, and more like a command center. I had evidence, understanding, and most importantly, time. Vera and her family were trapped by their own greed, unable to leave without what they'd come for, unable to find it because they didn't understand Margaret's way of thinking. Every day they stayed increased their risk. Every search made them more desperate. The clock was ticking, but now it was ticking in my favor. Marcus had chosen a quiet restaurant for our meeting, the kind where conversations stayed private and business was conducted in shadows. He'd found more than just deed irregularities. The property Garrett had transferred to Vera was indeed in Nevada, a worthless piece of desert purchased 3 years ago through a shell company linked to Dolores's maiden name, Kozlova. The entire transfer had been orchestrated before Garrett even met Vera, suggesting a level of planning that was staggering in its patience and cruelty. But the real shock was what Margaret had done. 2 years ago, she'd transferred partial ownership of the villa to a trust with specific triggering conditions. Even if the deed transfer had been legitimate, the trust would have prevented any sale or transfer without multiple notifications and waiting periods. She'd built legal walls around our home, anticipating this exact scenario. The papers she'd filed were so complex that even Marcus, with his expertise, admitted admiration for the strategy. I decided to risk everything on a hunch. I waited until I saw Vera's car leave with all of them inside, then used my hidden spare key to enter the villa. The smell of fresh paint in the basement was overwhelming, and I could see why. They'd painted over an entire wall, trying to hide something. But paint couldn't hide everything, especially when applied hastily. I could see the outline of what looked like a door. Edges too perfect to be natural. Using my phone's flashlight, I found a small depression in the wall, painted over but still accessible. When I pressed it, there was a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward. Behind it was a room I'd never known existed. Margaret had built this without my knowledge, probably during the renovations she'd insisted on 2 years ago when I'd been away visiting my brother. The secret room was her masterpiece, her final gift to us. Inside was like something from a spy movie. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer meticulously labeled. A desk held a computer, still humming with power. But the centerpiece was a safe built into the far wall with a digital timer counting down. 3 days, 14 hours, 27 minutes, and the seconds ticking away. A placard warned that any attempt to tamper with it would trigger an automatic response. I didn't dare touch it, but I photographed everything. The filing cabinets contained horrors. Photos of Vera with 3 different men over the years, all elderly, all wealthy, all dead within a few years of marriage. Medical records showing similar patterns of illness, starting with fatigue and confusion, ending with organ failure. Bank records showing money transfers from their estates to accounts controlled by Dolores and Silas. There was even evidence suggesting Vera's first husband hadn't died naturally, with lab reports questioning the official cause of death. One folder was labeled with my name and recent dates. Inside were my medical test results, showing ethylene glycol poisoning, receipts for antifreeze purchases I hadn't made, and surveillance footage of Vera and Dolores preparing my food. There were similar records for Garrett, showing lower levels of poisoning but following the same pattern. They were killing us both, just at different speeds. The realization that my son was also a victim changed everything. The computer required a password, but Margaret had left a hint in her typical style. Our anniversary date backward. When I logged in, I found hundreds of video files from hidden cameras throughout the house. Vera pouring antifreeze into my coffee, while Garrett stood nearby, looking uncomfortable but not intervening. Dolores grinding pills into food. Silas searching the house for valuables. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and perfectly documented. A sound from upstairs froze my blood. Car doors, voices, they were back early. I quickly photographed what I could, then slipped out of the hidden room, making sure it closed properly. The wet paint still showed my fingerprints, but there was nothing I could do about it. I made it to the basement window I'd left cracked open, squeezing through just as footsteps started down the stairs. I heard Vera's sharp voice asking who had been in the basement. From the garden shed, I watched through a crack as lights went on throughout the house. They were searching frantically, knowing someone had been there but not sure who or what they'd found. Vera stood at the basement door for a long time, staring at the painted wall, probably seeing the fingerprints. She called for Dolores, and they had an animated conversation in Russian, voices rising with panic. Silas appeared with what looked like a UV light, searching for more evidence of intrusion. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know you were here. They were trying to scare me, but they didn't know what I'd found." Another text from Garrett followed, asking where I was, saying they needed to talk urgently. I replied that I was at the pharmacy, would be back at the motel soon. The lie came easily now, deception becoming second nature in this war Margaret had prepared me for. Back at the motel, I uploaded everything to multiple cloud services, emailed copies to Marcus with instructions to open them only if something happened to me. The evidence was damning but also dangerous. If Vera and her family knew what Margaret had compiled, they might accelerate their plans or try to run. The countdown timer suggested something would happen in 3 days. But what? And why that specific timing? That evening, Marcus called with another piece of the puzzle. He'd found the private investigator Margaret had hired, Rodriguez, who'd specialized in suspicious deaths. Rodriguez had been building a case for 2 years, but had been warned off by someone with connections, threatened enough to leave the state. He'd given Margaret all his files before disappearing. The implication was clear. Vera's family had reached beyond just their immediate crimes. The motel room felt smaller that night, more vulnerable. Every sound could be them coming for me, but fear was just another emotion to manage. Margaret had faced death while conducting this investigation, building her trap while cancer consumed her body. If she could be that brave, that methodical, I could follow through on her plan. The timer was counting down to something she'd arranged, some revelation that couldn't be stopped or hidden. I made a decision. When the timer reached 0, I would be there with witnesses. I called Marcus, told him to be ready. I reached out to neighbors, casual invitations to stop by the villa in 3 days. I even contacted a journalist who'd covered one of Vera's previous husband's deaths, planting seeds of interest. Margaret had wanted this exposed publicly, undeniably, and I would ensure her wish was fulfilled. The next morning brought new urgency. Garrett called, saying Vera was insisting I come to discuss foundation problems they'd discovered. The timing was too convenient, too close to the timer's 0 point. They wanted me there for some reason, needed me present for whatever they were planning. It could be a trap, but it was also an opportunity. If they wanted an audience for their next move, I'd give them one they weren't expecting. I spent the day preparing, ensuring all evidence was secured and copies distributed. The photos from the hidden room were particularly damning, showing the scope of their crimes across multiple states and victims. Margaret had built a case that law enforcement couldn't ignore, media couldn't resist, and criminals couldn't escape. She'd turned our home into a justice delivery system, set to activate at precisely the right moment. As evening fell, I drove past the villa one more time. Through the windows I could see them arguing, Vera gesturing wildly, Dolores pacing, Silas loading boxes into the van. They were preparing to run, but couldn't leave without knowing what was in that safe. The timer had them trapped, curiosity and fear keeping them in place. Margaret had understood psychology as well as law, using their own greed and paranoia against them. The countdown continued relentlessly. In less than 3 days, whatever Margaret had planned would be revealed. The evidence would be exposed, the crimes documented, the killers caught in their own web. I thought about my wife, dying of cancer, but still fighting for us, still protecting us, still teaching until the very end. Her final lesson would be delivered soon, and it would be one that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. The paranoia in Vera's voice was unmistakable when she called the next morning. Her accent, usually carefully controlled, slipped through in moments of stress, revealing the Eastern European origins she'd tried to hide. She demanded to know where I'd been, who I'd been talking to, what I knew about the house's history. I kept my responses vague, letting her imagination fill the gaps with whatever fears were eating at her. The less I said, the more agitated she became, until finally insisting I come to the villa immediately. I agreed to come in 2 days, which would coincide with the timer reaching 0. The delay frustrated her, but she couldn't force me without revealing her desperation. After hanging up, I considered what I'd learned. They knew something was wrong, but didn't understand what Margaret had set in motion. Their paranoia was making them sloppy, reactive instead of strategic. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they could feel it even if they couldn't understand it. Marcus called with more disturbing information. He'd found records of 3 previous marriages for Vera, all following the same pattern. Elderly men with property, sudden illnesses, deaths within 3 years, and quick property transfers afterward. Portland, Phoenix, San Diego, each time moving to a new city, reinventing herself with slightly different details. Dolores had been there for all of it, playing the concerned mother-in-law. Silas appeared in the later cases as the helpful brother. They were a family business built on murder. The pattern was clear once you saw it laid out. They were professional killers who'd perfected their method over years. Margaret had somehow recognized the danger when I'd been too trusting, too wrapped up in grief to see the trap closing. She'd spent her final months fighting cancer while simultaneously fighting for our lives, gathering evidence with the patience of someone who knew she wouldn't be there to present it herself. The timer wasn't just counting down to evidence. It was her voice from beyond the grave. I spent the morning organizing everything into packages for different recipients. Police, FBI, journalists, lawyers, each would receive specific evidence relevant to their interests. Margaret had been thorough, providing not just accusations, but documented proof that would stand up in court. Photos, videos, financial records, medical tests, surveillance footage, all of it painted a picture of serial killers who'd operated with impunity for over a decade, until they'd chosen the wrong victims. That afternoon, Garrett called again. And this time Vera wasn't coaching him. His voice was different, smaller, scared. He told me Vera had been acting strange, pacing at night, speaking Russian on the phone, moving things in and out of the basement. She'd stopped pretending to be pregnant, dropped the act entirely. He'd tried to go into the basement, but she'd physically blocked him. He sounded like someone waking from a nightmare to find reality was worse than the dream. I wanted to tell him everything, to warn him about the poisoning, but I couldn't risk alerting Vera. Instead, I told him to be careful, to document anything suspicious, to protect himself. He asked what I meant, and I simply said his mother would have wanted him to be smart. The mention of Margaret made him quiet, and before hanging up, he whispered something that changed everything. "Dad, I think they've been putting something in my food, too." The revelation that Garrett knew, or at least suspected he was being poisoned, meant he might be ready to help. But it also meant he was in immediate danger. If Vera thought he was becoming a liability, she might accelerate his poisoning. I had to be careful, had to time everything perfectly. Margaret had set the timer for a reason, and I had to trust her judgment even now. I drove to the storage unit to retrieve more files. In a box marked with last year's date, I found something unexpected. A letter from Margaret to me, sealed and dated a week before her death. Inside, she'd written about her discoveries, her fears, her plans. She apologized for not telling me directly, explained that she was afraid I'd confront them too soon. She'd known she was dying, known she couldn't protect us in person, so she'd built an elaborate trap instead. The letter detailed what would happen when the timer reached 0. Documents would be automatically sent to law enforcement agencies, media outlets, and legal offices. The safe would open, revealing evidence that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. Hidden cameras would upload their footage to public servers. She'd even arranged for certain officials to be notified to be present. It wasn't just evidence, it was a coordinated strike designed to ensure justice couldn't be avoided. Reading her words, I felt her presence so strongly it was almost physical. She'd thought of everything, anticipated every move, created contingencies for contingencies. Every trip she'd taken in those final months, every meeting she'd attended, every dollar she'd spent had been part of this plan. She'd been playing a long game while everyone else was focused on the immediate. The timer wasn't just a countdown, it was the fuse on a carefully constructed bomb of truth. That evening I parked across from the villa, watching from a distance. The house was lit up like a beacon, every room blazing. Through the windows, I could see frantic activity. Vera on the phone, gesturing wildly. Dolores carrying boxes up from the basement. Silas loading things into a van. They were preparing to run, but something was keeping them there. The timer had them trapped between their greed and their fear, unable to leave without knowing what was in the safe. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just a photo of me sitting in my car at that moment. They were watching me watch them. A surveillance spiral that might have been funny if it weren't so dangerous. I didn't react. Just sat there letting them see me. Let them wonder what I was planning, what I knew. The psychological warfare Margaret had started was reaching its peak, and I was just another piece on her board. Around midnight, something interesting happened. A car pulled up to the villa, and a man got out. Someone I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, nervous-looking, constantly checking over his shoulder. Vera met him at the door, and they had an animated conversation. She seemed to be pleading. He was refusing. Finally, he threw something at her feet and drove off quickly. Vera stood in the doorway for a long moment before picking up whatever he'd left and going inside. I learned later that was their lawyer, or rather the criminal who'd been posing as one. He'd created the fake deeds, helped set up the shell companies, facilitated their previous crimes. But something had spooked him enough to cut ties. Maybe he'd heard about the investigation. Maybe he'd seen something that scared him. His departure was significant. Rats fleeing a sinking ship meant the ship was definitely sinking. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Garrett called several times, each conversation more desperate. Vera had stopped pretending entirely, he said. She and her family were speaking only Russian now, packing things, burning documents in the fireplace. They'd tried to break into the safe but couldn't even scratch it. The timer kept counting down, visible through its protective glass, taunting them with its inevitability. I made my final preparations, ensuring everything was in place for the confrontation. Marcus would arrive an hour before 0, accompanied by a colleague who specialized in criminal law. Several neighbors had agreed to stop by, curious about the drama they'd been sensing. I'd even reached out to a local journalist who'd covered one of Vera's previous husband's deaths, planting seeds of interest. The audience Margaret had wanted was assembling. The motel room felt like a bunker those final nights, a safe space before the battle. I barely slept, running through scenarios, planning for various outcomes. What if they tried to run? What if they became violent? But each time doubt crept in. I remembered Margaret's meticulous nature, her attention to detail. She'd been the best teacher I'd ever known, and this was her masterclass in justice. On the final morning, I woke to another text from the unknown number. "We're ready." Whether it was threat or resignation, I couldn't tell. Maybe they thought they were ready for whatever was coming, or maybe they were acknowledging defeat. Either way, in just a few hours, the timer would reach 0, and Margaret's final lesson would be delivered to an audience that included victims, perpetrators, and witnesses. I dressed carefully, choosing the suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, wanting her with me for this final act. In my pocket, I carried her letter, her words a talisman against whatever was coming. The drive to the villa felt both endless and too quick, time stretching and compressing like it does in dreams. Through the front window, I could see the grandfather clock, still keeping time, about to mark not just an hour, but the end of an era. As I pulled up, I saw the vehicles already gathering. Marcus's sedan, neighbors' cars, the van Silas had been loading. The house looked different somehow, like it was holding its breath. The morning sun was bright, almost harsh, perfect weather for revelations, for the pulling away of masks. I thought of Margaret, how she'd loved mornings like this, called them teaching weather because students couldn't hide in such clear light. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. In less than an hour, everything would change. The lies would be exposed, the truth revealed, and justice would begin its slow but inevitable process. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out and walked toward my house, ready to witness the storm Margaret had summoned from beyond the grave. The front door opened before I could knock, and Vera stood there looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, makeup smeared, clothes wrinkled, and stained with soot from burning documents. Behind her, the house was in chaos. Furniture pushed aside, boxes scattered, papers strewn across the floor like confetti at a funeral. The smell of smoke and fear permeated everything, mixing with something chemical that made my eyes water. They'd been trying desperately to destroy evidence, not knowing that it was already too late. She grabbed my arm with desperate strength, her nails digging through my jacket. Words poured out of her in a rush, half English, half Russian, demanding to know what I'd done, who I'd told, what was in the safe. Behind her, Dolores appeared, aged years in just days, clutching a rosary I'd never seen her hold before. The confident criminals who'd stolen my home were gone, replaced by panicked animals sensing a trap closing around them. Garrett emerged from the living room, and I barely recognized my son. He looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, moving carefully like each step hurt. The poisoning had accelerated. They'd increased his dose since discovering something was wrong. Whatever they'd been giving him, they were trying to finish him off quickly now. He reached out to me, his hand shaking, and in his eyes I saw fear, regret, and desperate hope. My son had been both perpetrator and victim, and only now was he understanding the full horror of what he'd been part of. Marcus arrived then with perfect timing, accompanied by his colleague and a forensic accountant. Their professional presence immediately shifted the dynamic. Vera released my arm, attempting to compose herself, trying to play hostess, but her hands shook too badly to maintain the facade. More people began arriving. The neighbors I'd invited, the journalist with her recorder already running. They gathered in the living room, their presence making it impossible for Vera to act on whatever violent impulses she might have had. The grandfather clock showed 45 minutes until 0, its ticking abnormally loud in the tense atmosphere. Vera kept glancing between it and the basement door, her eyes wild with combined rage and terror. She knew something momentous was coming but couldn't figure out what or how to stop it. Dolores had moved to the kitchen doorway, texting frantically on her phone. Silas stood near the basement stairs, tools in his hands, covered in dust and sweat from failed attempts to break into the safe. I walked to the center of the room and pulled out Margaret's letter, reading it aloud to the assembled witnesses. Her words filled the space with undeniable truth. She described discovering the poisoning, finding evidence of previous murders, setting up protections for our property and our lives. She apologized to Garrett for not protecting him better, for not seeing Vera's true nature sooner. She explained that everything she'd done was to ensure justice would be served, even from beyond the grave. When I finished reading, Vera lunged at me, screaming that it was all lies, that Margaret had been delusional from cancer. But Marcus was ready with documents, spreading them across the coffee table for everyone to see. The fake deed, the real trust papers, medical records showing poisoning, bank transfers from dead husbands' estates. Each piece of evidence was another nail in their coffin. The journalist was photographing everything, recording Vera's increasingly hysterical denials. Dolores tried to slip out the back door but found it blocked by a neighbor who'd come around through the garden. She turned back, trapped, and began speaking rapidly in Russian, what sounded like prayers or curses or both. Her carefully maintained American grandmother persona had completely crumbled, revealing someone foreign and frightening underneath. Silas had given up all pretense, standing by the basement door like a guard making his last stand. The timer showed 15 minutes, and the tension was almost unbearable. Everyone's eyes moved between the clock and the basement door, waiting for whatever revelation was coming. Garrett had collapsed onto the couch, too weak to stand, but his eyes were clear and focused for the first time in months. When Vera tried to go to him, playing the concerned wife one last time, he flinched away from her touch. The rejection was more powerful than any words could have been. Then the doorbell rang, and when Marcus opened it, 3 FBI agents entered. Badges displayed, weapons visible but not drawn. They'd received a package that morning, they explained, timed to arrive exactly 1 hour before the safe was set to open. Margaret had arranged this too, ensuring law enforcement would be present for whatever was about to be revealed. Vera's scream of rage echoed through the house, primal and defeated, the sound of someone realizing they'd been checkmated by a dead woman. The agents took positions around the room while one began reading Vera her rights. She wasn't under arrest yet, he explained, but they had questions about the deaths of 3 men in 3 different states. Dolores began to cry, harsh sobs that shook her entire body. Silas tried to edge toward the door, but was politely but firmly stopped. The house they'd stolen had become their prison, and Margaret had been the architect of their captivity. 5 minutes until 0. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to get louder, each second echoing through the room like a drumbeat. Everyone had moved closer to the basement door, drawn by inevitable curiosity. Vera had gone silent, staring at the door with pure dread. She knew that whatever was in that safe would be the final blow, the thing that would destroy any chance of escape or denial. When the timer finally reached 0, the soft beep it made was anticlimactic. But what followed was anything but subtle. The safe door swung open automatically, and a light inside illuminated its contents. Videos began playing on a screen built into the back wall, surveillance footage Margaret had collected over months. Vera pouring antifreeze into my coffee. Dolores grinding pills into Garrett's food. Silas removing security cameras. The evidence played on repeat for everyone to witness. But that wasn't all. The safe contained dozens of USB drives, each labeled with dates and crimes. One of the FBI agents, wearing gloves, carefully removed them and began reading the labels aloud. Vera Kozlova, murder of husband number 1, Portland, Oregon. Financial records, money laundering operation. Dolores Kozlova, illegal entry, false identity documents. Each label was another crime, another victim, another piece of their vast criminal enterprise. The journalist was recording everything, her eyes bright with the kind of story that made careers. The neighbors were backing away from Vera and her family like they were contaminated. Garrett was crying silently. Whether from relief or grief, I couldn't tell. And through it all, the grandfather clock kept ticking, marking time as Margaret's justice was finally delivered. Vera made one last, desperate attempt, echoing the words she'd used to throw me out. "This is theirs now. You are not allowed to come." But when she pulled out the deed, Marcus's colleague was ready with the real paperwork, showing that the deed was fraudulent, that the house had never left the trust Margaret had established. Vera's final card was as worthless as her promises of love to my son. The FBI agents moved in then, handcuffs appearing with practiced efficiency. Vera was arrested for murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Dolores for immigration violations and accessory to murder. Silas for identity theft and fraud. As they were led away, Vera turned back to look at me one last time. The hatred in her eyes was pure poison, but underneath was something else. Grudging respect for Margaret, the dying woman who'd defeated her from beyond the grave. The house emptied slowly, people leaving with stories they'd tell for years. The journalist promised to send me copies of everything she published. Marcus and his colleagues began the legal process of fully restoring the house to my ownership. The FBI agents took the contents of the safe as evidence, but not before making copies of everything for me. They mentioned that with this evidence, Vera and her family would likely never see freedom again. Garrett remained on the couch, too weak to move, but finally free from the poison that had been slowly killing him. I sat beside him, my son who'd betrayed me, but had also been a victim. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there in the house that had seen so much pain and deception. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, no longer counting down to anything, just marking time as it always had. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, I thought about Margaret and the incredible thing she'd accomplished. She'd saved both her son and husband while dying of cancer, had fought a battle against killers while fighting for every breath. She'd been a teacher to the end, and her final lesson was one that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. That love is stronger than greed. That truth is more powerful than lies. And that sometimes the dead can reach out from beyond the grave to protect those they left behind. The revelation was complete. The truth fully exposed. The criminals caught and contained. Margaret's plan had worked perfectly, every detail falling into place like pieces of a complex puzzle she'd designed. The house was ours again, cleansed of the evil that had tried to claim it. But more than that, justice had been served in the most public way possible, ensuring that Vera and her family could never hurt anyone again. 3 months had passed since the timer reached 0, since truth exploded in our living room like a bomb made of justice. The villa stood quiet now, its rooms no longer echoing with Russian threats or the sound of documents burning. Garrett and I sat in the kitchen where his mother had taught him to make cookies, where Vera had poisoned our coffee, where redemption and betrayal had shared the same space. Between us sat 2 cups of tea, steam rising in the afternoon light, neither of us quite ready to drink yet. Trust took time to rebuild, even with yourself. The doctors said Garrett would make a full recovery, though the damage from the antifreeze would take months to completely heal. His kidneys had suffered, his liver had struggled, but he was young enough to bounce back physically. The emotional damage was harder to measure. He'd loved Vera, or thought he had, and discovering that your wife had been slowly murdering you while smiling across the breakfast table wasn't something you recovered from quickly. He'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in victims of long-term manipulation. Vera's trial had been swift and decisive. The evidence Margaret had compiled was so comprehensive that her lawyers had tried to negotiate a plea deal within a week. But the FBI had connected her to 5 murders across 3 states, and no prosecutor was willing to deal. She'd been sentenced to life without parole. Her final performance in court, a masterclass in fake tears that fooled no one. Dolores had gotten 25 years, Silas 15. Their criminal enterprise had collapsed completely. All stolen assets seized, victims' families finally getting closure. The journalist's story had gone viral, then national, then international. The headline, "Dead Woman Solves Her Own Murder Attempt," has captured imaginations worldwide. Margaret had become posthumously famous, her meticulous planning praised by law enforcement professionals everywhere. The hidden room had been photographed and analyzed, her methods studied and admired. I kept the articles in a folder, not out of pride, but as proof that sometimes love really was stronger than evil. Marcus had helped me set up a foundation in Margaret's name, using the seized assets from Vera's crimes. We funded programs that helped elderly people protect themselves from financial predators, educated families about warning signs of slow poisoning, provided resources for those who suspected they were being victimized but didn't know how to prove it. Every person we helped was another victory for Margaret, another student learning from her final lesson. The foundation's logo was a simple clock, always pointing to the moment when truth defeats lies. Garrett had moved back in temporarily while he recovered, taking his old room where his mother had read him bedtime stories. We didn't talk much at first, the betrayal too fresh, the guilt too heavy. But gradually, over shared meals and quiet evenings, we began to reconnect. He told me about the signs he'd ignored, the red flags he'd explained away, the slow realization that something was wrong but feeling too weak and confused to act. I told him about his mother's strength, her determination, her refusal to let cancer stop her from protecting us. The villa had been professionally cleaned, every trace of Vera's family removed. But sometimes I still caught phantom scents of her perfume, or heard echoes of Dolores's complaints. Trauma left impressions that took time to fade. But other impressions were stronger. Margaret's laughter in the garden, Garrett's first steps in the living room, 25 years of real love that 3 years of deception couldn't erase. The house was reclaiming itself, remembering what it had been before the invasion. The grandfather clock still kept perfect time, its steady ticking a comfort now rather than a countdown. I'd had it serviced, the clockmaker amazed at its condition. He'd found a note inside, tucked behind the pendulum, in Margaret's handwriting. Time reveals everything. Patience wins wars. Love transcends death. She'd hidden messages everywhere. I was still finding them. Little reminders that she'd been thinking of us even in her final days. Some nights I dreamed about her. Not sick and frail as she'd been at the end, but strong and vibrant, standing in the hidden room she'd created, surrounded by evidence and plans. In the dreams, she'd smile at me, that teacher's smile when a student finally understood a difficult concept. She never spoke in these dreams, didn't need to. Her work had said everything necessary. She'd written her love in legal documents and surveillance footage, expressed her protection through careful planning and perfect timing. Garrett had started dating again, cautiously, with someone he'd known from college who'd reached out after seeing the news. She was nothing like Vera, quiet and genuine, a nurse who understood trauma and healing. They took things slow, rebuilding his ability to trust, to believe that not everyone who claimed to love you was secretly poisoning your food. I watched him slowly return to himself, the son I'd raised emerging from the shadow of what Vera had turned him into. The hidden room had been sealed, but not destroyed. I'd had it converted into a small library filled with Margaret's books, her teaching materials, photos of our life together. It was a shrine not to her death, but to her life, to the woman who'd been so much more than her final act of justice. Sometimes I sat there, surrounded by her presence, and felt peace rather than pain. She'd won her last battle, saved her family, and ensured her love would outlive her body. One evening, as autumn turned the leaves gold and red, Garrett and I stood in the garden she'd loved so much. The roses were blooming one last time before winter, their perfume carrying on the cool breeze. We didn't speak, didn't need to. We both knew what we'd lost, what we'd survived, what we'd learned. The villa stood behind us, solid and safe again, no longer a crime scene but a home. The grandfather clock chimed 6 o'clock, its bronze tone carrying across the yard, marking not an ending but a continuation. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give isn't money or property, or even justice. What would you do if you were in my position? Please share your thoughts below. And remember, sometimes the dead speak loudest when the living finally learn to listen.